great. So thank you so much for coming. And we're going to talk about Bitcoin mining and carbon emission reduction. And I'm going to show that Bitcoin mining, we can actually make Bitcoin mining green. Bitcoin mining could be good for the environment. I'm going to show you why. All right. So just the background of this study. Is this working? The background of this study is that we know that Bitcoin mining consumes a lot of electricity. So a naive interpretation of this electricity consumption is that, okay, yeah, Bitcoin mining is not green, Bitcoin mining hurts the environment, right? There is actually there was a very controversial paper on one of the subjournals of Nature a couple of years ago. They argued that just Bitcoin mining alone is going to increase global warming by 2 degrees Celsius. There's a lot of a controversy about that paper published there, but you know, it's a publication. Right, so some people believe in that, right? I personally have also talked to some very famous scholars in China, and that guy just touted to me very proudly, saying that he wrote a report focusing on Bitcoin mining's environmental harm, and he argued that his report led to China's ban of Bitcoin mining in 2021. Right? So there are probably more reasons behind this, but at least there are some people also take pride of attacking Bitcoin mining. However, I would like to point out that it's uncontroversial, it's non-disputable that Bitcoin mining consumes a lot of electricity. But whether that electricity consumption necessarily translates into environmental harm or carbon emission actually needs more scrutiny. Especially if the source of electricity for Bitcoin mining comes from renewable sources, then it may not necessarily be the case that Bitcoin mining actually increase carbon emission. Right? So, this paper, what I'm going to show is that there's actually one step further. We can take it even a step further. If we design the electricity pricing policy well, combined with the fact that Bitcoin mining could be conducted using renewable energy, the total carbon emission in the entire economy, when we compare the case with Bitcoin mining versus without Bitcoin mining, the case with Bitcoin mining, the total emission could actually be lower, okay? So in order to understand this, we need to look at what are some unique features of renewable energy, and also look at some of the unique attributes of Bitcoin mining, and to see how these two kind of work with each other. So Bitcoin mining, let's first look at renewable energy. Right? Renewable energy has 2 major advantages and 2 major disadvantages. The 2 major advantages, first is the carbon emission is very low, right? Once whenever the wind is blowing, you generate electricity. It doesn't really, you don't have to burn fuels, right? Burn coals. And also the variable cost to produce renewable energy is relatively cheap. Right? Just like when the wind blows, electricity is generated. Or in the hydro case, right, when the water flows, okay, electricity is generated. The variable cost is low, and we can just kind of approximate them as being 0. Okay, so these are the advantages of renewable energy. There are also 2 disadvantages of renewable energy. First is that the initial fixed cost to build the capacity is high. Right? And for hydro, you need to build a dam. For wind turbine, for wind, you need to install the turbines. So the fixed cost is high. And second is that the supply of renewable is very volatile. It may be intermittent. When the wind stops blowing, there's no way the electricity can be generated. Like in off season, when there's not enough water, and the hydro electricity does not work. Right. And also importantly, these volatile supply does not necessarily come in sync with the electricity demand. And electricity is a good that has this kind of very important property that they have to be consumed whenever it's generated. There are some caveat to that. There, like electricity storage may kind of play some role to ease the imbalance between supply and demand. But given current technology, electricity storage is still very limited. Right. So we can kind of approximately, first order approximation, just to think about, electricity has to be generated whenever it's consumed. Sorry, it has to be consumed whenever it's generated. And if the electricity generation from renewables does not always come in sync with the demand, then we have to use burning fuels, burning coals, right, to basically balance the imbalance, to absorb this shock. That also limits the adoption of renewable energy. Now let's look at what are some unique attributes of Bitcoin mining. First and foremost, the Bitcoin mining consumes a lot of electricity. That's not disputable. And second, what is important is that Bitcoin mining relies on this so-called proof of work process. And the rewards from proof of work we can model this as a Poisson arrival. And so it's memoryless. So what it means that you can quickly turn on or turn off a mining machine without affecting its subsequent operations. If we think about any other industrial uses that consumes a lot of electricity, this property is pretty unique. Think about, for example, distilling aluminum, right? It's difficult for us just to turn down the aluminum distillers for like, say, 2 minutes and then just return it, right? You're gonna disrupt the entire process. But that's not the case for Bitcoin, right? You shut down the Bitcoin mining for 2 minutes, okay, yeah, you don't get rewarded, no, you don't get the expected reward for that 2 minutes. But once you return it back again, everything just like as if nothing has happened, right? So this is something very unique to Bitcoin mining. So now if we think about this particular property associated with the fact that there's going to be imbalance between the electricity supply and the demand from renewables. Without Bitcoin mining, we have to rely on the supply side, rely on fuel-based energy, right, to absorb any shocks. Now we can actually turn to the demand side. We can try to induce Bitcoin miners to adjust the intensity of their Bitcoin mining and potentially use that as a shock absorber. So that means that most of the time, we can build more renewable capacity and let most of electricity demand to be reliant on renewables. And then whenever there is imbalance there's a shortage of electricity, generated from renewables, and we just like induce the miners to shut down their machines. And that becomes a shock absorber. And because of Bitcoin mining also it brings a lot of reward, that also basically comes a way to finance or to incentivize the capacity building of renewable energy capacity in the first place. So you can see that Bitcoin mining basically helps us overcome all these both problems at the same time. So, and it's based on this insight. If we design electricity pricing policy well to induce miners to turn on and turn off at the appropriate time, Bitcoin mining the introduction of Bitcoin mining could actually make the total emission in the entire economy lower. Okay, so this is basically the intuition of this study. Okay, so for the rest of the talk, I'm basically just going to return to math and just to formalize, just saying that I'm not like BS here. Okay, this is actually I can prove it mathematically. Okay, this is not working. This is also not working. Good. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to develop a very simple model of the electricity market. And the market has a demand side and a supply side, okay? And on the demand side of electricity, there are two sources of electricity demand. One is what I call a regular electricity demand. Just you can think about any electricity demand that is not coming from Bitcoin miners. And for simplicity, let's assume that it's exogenously given, okay, and it's random, right? So there's some volatility in terms of how households or industries are going to consume electricity. And the second source of electricity demand comes from profit maximizing Bitcoin miners, okay? And so how much electricity the miners are going to consume is going to be dependent on the price that they're being charged. So by the way, I'm gonna use the d tilde, the capital D tilde. Tilde always, whenever I have tilde, it means a random variable, okay? So d tilde, I use d tilde to capture the first source of electricity demand that is coming from non-Bitcoin miners. And I assume the electricity demand from Bitcoin miners to be a function of the price P, capital P, that is charged to the miners. Okay, so in reality, in actual implementation, this may also depend on some other variables. For example, what's the price of Bitcoin? But for simplicity, let's just remove that part. And there's also without loss of generality, because if we just add If I add that back, it just means that I need to make the function look a little bit different, but it's really just adding more notation, but really doesn't change the conclusion of the result. Okay. All right, so this is the demand side for electricity. Now let's look at the supply for electricity. On the supply side, there are two players I'm going to consider. One is what I call a regulator. What does the regulator do? The regulator stipulates what is the electricity pricing policies. So it specifies electricity price, which I denote as lowercase p, to the regular demand, right, to the first source of demand. And those, and also a pricing policy that is charged to Bitcoin miners. And for simplicity, I assume the price charged to the unit price charged to households or just regular demand is a constant. And the one that is charged to the Bitcoin miners is a function depending on how the grid is operating. So this is in the electricity market, this is called a demand response program. Okay, and so this is pretty widely adopted. So in this, by the assumption here, basically the specification here embeds two types of assumptions. First is that we said the regulator is able to price discriminate between regular demand and Bitcoin mining. And this is feasible to do because in reality now, Bitcoin mining is mostly conducted in large institutionalized Bitcoin mining farms, usually operated in very remote areas. Usually have their own transition lines. So it's easy to distinguish between the demand from miners and other sources. And also in reality, for example, in Texas, in the US, there are a lot of empirical evidence showing that these Bitcoin miners, they do have separate contracts with grids. So it's indeed possible to price discriminate between these two sources of electricity demand. And the second is that we assume that just because of having the P as a function, that means that the grid is able to, the regulator is going to be able to charge different electricity prices based on the supply and demand conditions, as we call it, demand response program. Because this demand response program is actually pretty widely adopted, so this is also something that is feasible to do. All right. So this is other than the regulator, there's another actor on the supply side of electricity is what is going to be a profit maximizing power grid. Okay, the operator, the actual operator of the electricity generation and transmission. So what does the power grid do? The power grid is going to take the regulator's electricity pricing policies as given, and then to maximize their own profit. And what can they choose to optimize their profit? First and foremost, they can choose how much renewable capacity K to build in the first place. You can think about, I use K to denote basically capital. Okay, this is the initial capital investment you need to put in place on how many turbines do you install, how many dams do you build, okay? And once these capacity is in place, then in the operation stage, the power grid is going to decide on how much electricity demand to meet, okay? And you can probably quickly see that, well, by the way, I did want to mention that I assume the electricity pricing policy to the regular guys is higher than the unit cost of burning fuels. Right. So it means that when for the power grid, when you satisfy the regular electricity demand, you always make a profit. So you will always try to meet the demand from the regular sources. And so the question is just basically how much demand do you satisfy from Bitcoin miners? Okay. So if this is the amount of the electricity demand that the power grid want to satisfy, okay, and the electricity generated from renewables is going to be what the K times S. The K is how much capacity there is. Okay, the S you can think about is in the terminology of electricity market, this is called capacity factor. What you really can think about is like the utilization ratio of installed renewable capacity. You can think about how this is like, it's like kind of, you can think about it as a random variable between 0 and 1 and indicating how strong the wind is blowing, right? If the wind is blowing at full speed so that the wind turbine is actually running in its full speed, then this will be 1. And if the wind stops blowing, this else till that becomes 0. The same for hydro, right? If there's no water, then it's zero. So that's why the electricity generated from renewables is going to be the product of how much capacity you have in place times what percentage of the capacity is actually being used right? So whenever there is a shortage between the electricity demand that the power grid wants to satisfy and the supply from the actual supply from renewables, any differences has to be satisfied by burning coals, burning fuels, and that will come at a variable cost of C. Okay. All right. So I hope that this is clear. And once we're clear with how the market operates, then we can basically look at what are the optimization problems that all the players face, and then we can see what the equilibrium will look like. Oh, I forgot this does not work. Yes. So the regulator's problem, I assume that the regulator would like to reduce, to minimize the total emission. What is the total emission in the economy? Well, so here is the demand that we would like to satisfy, the power grid would like to satisfy, and here is the actual electricity supply coming from renewable resources. And we know that whenever there's a difference, and if and only if this difference is positive, there will be emission, because that's the only time when you actually will burn coals, okay? And there's some parameters, basically just kind of you can basically ignore this, just a constant that multiply by this. But really, this is measuring the total emission, and of course, because the demand, the regular demand and the capacity factor, these are random variables, so you need to take expectation. So this is the expected amount of total emission that the entire economy will have. Okay. So when the regulator's problem, of course, is to choosing the pricing policies. But when the regulator is choosing the pricing policies, the regulator needs to take into account that the power grid is going to optimally respond to the pricing policies that they set to maximize their own profit. Okay, so especially like, for example, how much renewable capacity is going to be in place is going to be coming out of the optimal choice from the power grid. So then what is the power grid's optimization problem? So the power grid is trying to maximize its own profit, and by choosing how much renewable capacity to build in the first place. What is its profit, right? So this expression may look a little bit overwhelming, but I hope that I will go one by one, and hopefully you can see it actually should make a lot of sense. So first of all, like your profit from operation is basically your revenue minus your cost. What are the revenue? There are two sources of revenue. First, you can charge revenues from regular demand. That is going to be the price that is charged to them, multiply how much actual demand there is. Right? So the revenue from miners is going to be the price charged to the miners, multiplied by how much electricity demand there will be coming from miners. Right? So these are the two sources of revenue. And minus two sources of cost. What are the two sources of cost? One cost you can think about is like an operating cost. This has takes a very similar form as the objective of the regulator's problem. Because here it is like, we see that whenever the electricity demand exceeds the actual supply from renewables, and if and only if this part is positive, then we need to burn fuels. We need to burn coals. And the unit cost of burning coals is this lowercase c. So this is really just like, so that's why I also, because only when this term is positive multiplied by c, this is going to be the electricity generation cost. Okay. And the second source of cost is really just the initial cost to build the capacity in the first place. And I denote this as to a multiplication of the capital C and multiply by how much capacity to build. Okay? So basically this entire problem summarizes you can think about this is actually a principal agent problem, right? The principal is the regulator choosing the electricity pricing policies, and the agent is like the power grid, right? Taking the pricing policy as a given, decide on how much capacity to build, and the regulator's the objective is to minimize the total emission, but it needs to take into account that there's a misalignment between incentives between the two actors. The power grid like to maximize their profit, especially they may not build enough capacity because it's costly to do so. Okay. All right. So I would like to, so if we just look at this problem, right, these two expressions look a little bit different. There are some elements are similar, but they still look a little bit different. I'm going to simplify this problem a little bit more. I'm going to argue that this profit maximization problem for the power grid, we can actually just reduce it to a very simple cost minimization problem. And that would actually look very similar to the regulator's problem. So let's see how it looks like. So here I'm just copying the objective of the power grid, again, coming from the previous slide. And we see that the first term here is actually does not really depend on the capacity that is actually be built. So we actually can just drop this term out of the objective. And the second term, I'm going to argue that is actually also going to be independent of how much capacity is being built. In the paper, there's a more formal derivation about why this is the case. But what you can really think about just from a very simple intuitive perspective is the following. If we are willing to assume that Bitcoin mining is perfectly competitive, that means that Bitcoin miners earn zero economic profit. And that means that whatever they pay to the power grid is going to be equal to the mining reward. And the mining reward is going to be the price of Bitcoin times how many Bitcoins that you can mine during a fixed amount of time, which given a long enough time, we know it's basically predetermined by the Bitcoin mining's release schedule. So this term is also kind of exogenous, and it's independent of how much capacity you want to build. So we can basically kill these two terms out of this profit maximization problem, and then it just basically reduces to this cost minimization problem. And if we now just put the regulator's problem and the power grid's problem again, then now we see the two objectives actually look quite similar with each other, right? The only difference is that just there's extra term of this capacity building. So how do we go from here? I think for me, it's always useful just to think about some extreme cases, okay? And so that we can gain some intuition about what this setup is going to give to us. So we know that there's an incentive misalignment between the regulator and the power grid because of this term. What if we just get rid of this term in the first place, right? Let's get rid of this term for the moment. So then we just try to look for what is the first best outcome, right? So the first best outcome probably is going to give us some indication about what the second best would look like. If I get rid of this term, so we just look at the first best outcome, we can see what is going to be the optimal. What should be the optimal K that we choose to minimize the total emission? Well, because if there's no cost of building the capacity in the first place, then why don't we just take this K to infinity? Let's build as many dams and install as many wind turbines as possible, because there's no cost of doing it anyway, right? And if this is large enough, then if we are willing to assume that the demand for electricity have some upper limit, and if we're willing to assume that the capacity factor is the lower bound of it, lower support of it, is going to be strictly above zero, then we can basically fulfill all electricity demand from renewable resources. So that means that the total emission in the economy will be exactly zero. Right? So we can see that, okay, well, of course, when I come to this conclusion, there are two important assumptions which is not realistic. One is assuming that the capacity factor is always bounded away from zero, and second, assuming that it does not incur any cost to build capacity. But at least we can see that in some extreme cases, the total emission in the entire economy, when we have a Bitcoin in place, can actually be zero. That actually gives some confidence to show that even if we consider all the second best frictions, it's possible for total emission to be lower than what would be the case in which Bitcoin mining is not introduced at all. Okay. So so this slide, the bullet points here basically just summarizes the argument I put out here. Again, just in summary, is that if we are thinking about the first best outcome, the total carbon emission could be zero. And I'm going to now show is that it's possible in the second best case for the, it's not going to be zero anymore, right? But it's possible for the total carbon emission to be lower than the case in which there is no Bitcoin mining at all. Okay. Yeah. So for the sake of time, I'm going to just give you a simple illustration. And here is a demand schedule. So I'm not going to prove that this schedule is optimal or whatever, okay? But I'm just going to construct a Bitcoin mining, the electricity pricing policies. And I'm going to show that for that particular policy, it's possible for the total emission to be lower when there is Bitcoin mining in place compared to when there is no Bitcoin mining. Okay, so I'm going to take a more humble objective, but it kind of is in line with the main argument of the paper. So what I'm going to be considering is a very simple pricing policy. By the way, like when we think about the pricing policy, what we really need to think about is just like a pricing policy to induce a certain amount of Bitcoin mining quantity for given how the grid has been operating. Right. So we basically the choice of choosing the pricing policy is really kind of be induced by choosing the demand from Bitcoin mining. Okay. So I'm going to specify the following policy to induce this pattern of Bitcoin mining demand. So the first part is relatively straightforward and intuitive. We say that when the supply from renewables is larger than the demand from just the regular demand, then all the surplus, extra renewable electricity supply, we give to Bitcoin miners. Bitcoin miners can just mine for free because otherwise these electricity generated just going to be somehow wasted anyway, right? So why don't we let Bitcoin miners mine? Okay. The second part may actually be a little bit counterintuitive, and this is also something we did not learn, we did not know before we start this project. So there are a lot of, so it's very natural to think about, oh, maybe whenever the electricity generated, electricity supply is not enough to cover the regular demand. It's very natural for us to think, oh, maybe we should curtail Bitcoin mining. We should ban Bitcoin mining, okay, at those times because in those cases, we actually need to burn fuels. So it's bad for the environment. There increases carbon emission. However, this is not completely true. So it turns out it will be optimal it would indeed be optimal to curtail Bitcoin mining a little bit at that time. But the actual curtail amount is not zero. The reason is the following, because we need to take this exposed incentives and ex ante incentive into consideration. So we know that whenever we allow, in this particular case, we allow Bitcoin miners to mine using electricity generated from burning coals. That's polluting, that's bad for the carbon emission, but that's also a case in which the power grid doesn't like, because burning fuels incurs variable cost. Okay, so this is actually also a painful case for the regulator, for the power grid. So because of that, if we say that, okay, we'll commit to allow Bitcoin minings to mine regardless of whether, to a certain extent, regardless of whether there is extra demand or not. So that basically imposes some pain on the power grid. Power grid says, this is painful case situation. And so in their ex ante capacity building decisions, they're gonna think about, okay, if I ever fall into this case, it's gonna hurt me. So I want to avoid this case as much as possible. So how can I avoid this case? Well, I should build up more K so that this situation just does not happen as often. Right? I want to lower the probability of this falling into this situation in the first place. So it's kind of like exposed, we commit to let Bitcoin miners operate, even though the renewable electricity is not enough to cover the demand. That will induce the ex ante incentive to build up more renewable capacity. Okay, so just some illustration. I'm going to skip all the math here, but just like kind of summarize. So what we draw here is that if we make some special assumptions, like we assume that the demand and the regular demand and the capacity factor follow some independent uniform distributions. And then we can basically visualize the pattern here. So what we draw here is how much renewable capacity, how much Bitcoin mining do you allow miners to run when a renewable electricity supply is not enough to cover regular demand. Okay, and the vertical axis just plots the total emission. So what we can show is that it's possible for when we allow Bitcoin miners to mine, initially emission will go up, but it's possible that once we pass a certain threshold, the total emission will go down. And this really comes from the fact that it just induces the power grid to build more renewable capacity, install more turbines, build more dams in the first place. So it's possible for at the minimum point, at the sweet spot, the total emission is actually going to be lower than when Bitcoin mining is completely banned, right? So this indicates that, like, for example, some of the policy, for example, adopted by China in 2021, touted by one of our colleagues, may be a little bit misguided. So so I think I'm going to summarize here, and this is still early stage work, and we want to fully solve the optimal policy, and we want to relate closer to what people have done in reality in the literature, and want to look into data to calibrate some more model parameters. But these are ongoing work, and if there's any other suggestion, I'll be very welcome for that. And with that, that's all I have, and thank you for your attention.